Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Surf's Up from 2007. Surf's Up is, in a lot of ways, an interesting movie. It's kind of like if someone took a movie that probably wouldn't be that interesting or still be talked about in any fashion, but how originally they made this film is kind of what makes it sort of special. It's really a lot more conceptual than we usually get nowadays, and for animated films especially then. Surf's Up is a really original way to make a really uninteresting movie. Probably sums it up in a way, but Surf's Up is kind of just a normal animated film. The main character is following his dreams. He wants to be something. He discovers something about himself. There's a love interest. I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of this are things you've seen a lot of times before, but I've never seen an animated film try to be kind of a documentary. It's incredibly meta of a concept. It's kind of interesting that this is pre-Spider-Verse, which was incredibly meta on so many different levels at once, and this is probably the only thing from this animation studio that has like maybe any sort of similarities to that meta level. Is it as good or as groundbreaking? No, not at all. But it's at least an interesting way to take this kind of a movie. Now, taking on the idea that most major surfing films are either Endless Summer or Riding Giants, which are documentaries, and then kind of using that, since most of our kind of film language around surfing is from documentaries. If you're making an animated film about surfing, you'd have to acknowledge that. So they do that. Now, it apparently does take an actual surfing drama on North Shore and takes elements from that too. It's kind of like, well, how do we imagine surfing in a movie as a documentary? So this story of a penguin who wants to be a surfer and go off and compete in the surfing competition because he saw Big Z surf when he was a really little kid around in his hometown. He definitely absolutely wants to become a surfer, and he goes to the surfing competition, kind of learns more about himself and what being a surfer really means and so forth. And that doesn't sound that interesting, but showing it through the lens of a documentary with these two documentary filmmakers who are played by the two directors of this film, who are Chris Buck and Ash Brannon, they really have a lot of kind of fun with that concept. And they use it narratively very well. Like, let's explain who Big Z is through archival footage and stuff. Let's show, they have a joke about what happened to his dad, and they show a picture of his dad, zoom out, and there's like a killer whale about to eat him. They use that really to their advantage a lot of the times, and apparently actually let a lot of the actors like improv and even be in the same space at the same time, so you can kind of feel that energy to it. It has a looseness, has a more realness that you would expect from a documentary. Most animated films, this person has scheduling conflicts and so forth. I think there was a little bit of that going on. I think there are a few people who didn't get to, but for the most part they recorded together, and I know people like Home Movies and Bob's Burgers and things like that do that, but you can really feel that, and it kind of always sort of feels like a documentary. There's a few times it doesn't. The camera's always kind of moving around and so forth. I think there's a time they kind of ride around the volcano. I don't know, I guess they're sort of, I wouldn't say skateboarding, but moving around these tracks on a volcano. That didn't look very documentary style, but other than that sequence, everything else, the camera's always moving. You're always very aware of the camera, and noticeably you're supposed to be. And documentary style, between things like Arrested Development and the fact that documentaries were sort of a bigger deal then, you had documentaries grossing over $100 million. You had Super Size Me and March of the Penguins and Inconvenient Truth. These were big talking points, major movies that normal people saw and stuff. So documentaries were a bigger deal at the time, so it sort of made sense to make this. This is very mid 2000s in a lot of what it's doing. This is better directed than it is written and a movie, because how it's directed is why you'd still talk about it. That's how I've remembered it, because I remember when it came out, people would talk about it. Well, it's an animated film, but it's made like a documentary, and I was like, what? And then I didn't see it till now. I remembered, hey, I've always heard Surf's Up's kind of interesting, and it stuck out to me. And I knew people at the time who were like, oh, I might check out Surf's Up because I hear it's this different kind of a thing. I think that kind of makes it a little more memorable than just being animated film B released in Q2 or something like that, which it often feels like with a lot of this stuff. Sony Animation, this is their I think they're before Spider-Verse, their only animated film to get a Oscar nomination for Best Animated Feature, and rightfully so, because I think it really shows a real originality to the direction. I almost wanted to like it more, even though by the end part, I kind of knew everything that was gonna happen, not because I'd seen it or it was spoiled, just because it was very predictable. But I was so into it with how they made it and how they cut to talking heads suddenly, and even clearly had audio of real surfers at the one point where they're talking about the tunnel between the wave and when the waves I don't know, I'm not a surfer, I shouldn't be describing these things, but when the waves like kind of like crashing and you can see that little tunnel between the wave and the ocean and stuff, that sounded like real like archival audio. I didn't see where that was from actually, or what surfers they interviewed, but it sounded like that to me. I actually like Shia LaBeouf. I thought he had a good energy. He had good charisma with Jeff Bridges in this. Zooey Deschanel was alright. Most of the voice cast, like James Woods playing a manager, is pretty on the nose, but it works. I especially like that Ash Brandon and Chris Buck are both doing the voices of both the filmmakers filming this. I thought was really entertaining. Like, obviously they're directing it, but it's like funny, like even in the reality of the movie they're directing this. I actually like John Heder, and I didn't check, like I just watched movies. When I watched them, I didn't look up who it was, and I found myself going like, oh, this is probably like a voice actor who's got this stoner thing down, and I was like, oh, it's Napoleon Dynamite. Wow. So I've noticed when he's in animated films, because he has such a sort of distinct voice, it sort of works out more for him. Maybe he should have done that. I don't know what he does now, but man, they should make like a Napoleon Dynamite animated show or something. The problem with this movie is that like the surfing parts of it and the main plot and what it's trying to do feels so much like you're watching any animated film. But the concept and how it's directed and everything like that is like so unique. You kind of want to build up Surf's Up and be like, oh my god, did you see Surf's Up? It's like so different, and it's like doing this documentary thing, and like it's kind of smart what it's doing. And then you sit down with the movie, and after a while, while I was getting bored, I was kind of like, oh, I mean, maybe that's not enough to break through this sort of thing. So I don't think it's a substantially amazing film, mainly because of the script is a little subpar, frankly, but they loosened up the actors way more than you usually get from this. They, you know, had fun with the concept. There's literally film grain throughout this entire movie, which is pretty cool. Some of the times I've noticed with Sony Animation with this and Spider-Verse, I really like when they'll like break through, because it feels like when they do it, they kind of go all in on the huge possibilities of filmmaking and animation, and Surf's Up definitely has that in there. It's just kind of like constrained by like a script that like isn't that different, you know. It's like, well, if you did the same script as a documentary, would it be better? I'm like, not really. I mean, I think there's certain films that can actually work for really well, but with Surf's Up, I think the thing that holds it back the most is that it's just kind of like your average kind of animated movie. Chris Buck, who would go on to direct things like Frozen and previously directed Tarzan, and Ash Brandon, who would go on to direct Rock Dog, they went on to other things. But with Chris Buck, you can kind of see throughout all his films, he's able to kind of do interesting, you know, designs or interesting ideas, or figuring out how the best way to tell a story. Like even when you look at Frozen, it's not your average kind of princess thing. And same with, I think, Surf's Up. It's like he looked at, well, I have this story, how do I tell it? And I think that shows the signs of a good director, that he clearly like really, really thinks about that aspect, the presentation aspect of filmmaking, which is a major part of it. And I think, you know, Surf's Up is something that you can think about the theory of it really well. It's like really fun to think about and watch the theory of it. But it's like, you know, oh cool, Jeff Bridges plays a surfer guy. It's like very on the nose a lot of the time. It's very kind of boring in what it's doing. It's just kind of more special because of like how they did it, and that made it worthwhile. I'm like kind of glad I saw it. I believe in Chris Buck a little bit more. I've seen all of his filmography now, I guess, but I think Surf's Up doesn't like completely wipe out or anything. Get it? I think it should probably be hailed a little bit more, because it shows like what a studio can do with something. As an experiment, it's an excellent movie. As a movie, it's like sort of normal. You know, I think it gets above average kind of ratings and remembered better, because in comparison to other things, it's actually really good. But in terms of like what it actually is, you kind of sit there and realize it's just kind of the same old thing, and you're not really that interested in it other than that. So even though this is like, while you're watching it and has its pop punk songs and its surf kind of mythos and all that stuff, you don't think of it as like this kind of more interesting art movie, but that's sort of what you're taking from it. You're taking from the artistic side of it. You're not taking from the script or the story or the characters or anything like that. You know, you're thinking about Jeff Bridges, but you're mainly thinking about him and his whole mythos, not the character in this actual movie. And I'd say same with Shia and everything like that. The main thing I kept thinking about after I watched it was how it was made, not the actual story of the film, and this is a story-based movie. So it's just like a little better than your average animated film because Chris Buck and Ash Brandon kind of like forced it to be something more. It feels like they pushed this film to be as good as it could ever have been with their documentary style. Doing this as like, hey, we're making a documentary about this situation. But I mean, it's like the whole thing with Big Z, and then you find out he's not really dead. Spoilers, I guess, but that was really stupid. And then it's like you get into the competition and stuff. It just felt like, you know, it would break from the documentary thing to make sure it had this big animated movie type of plot, and that was really those parts of it were kind of unsurprising and sort of boring. But I think this movie like tries its hardest to make something that seems boring at this point be a lot more interesting than it has any right to be. So if you've seen Surf's Up and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.